Now we're going to begin looking at step 3. What are the expectations for my students? So far up to this point, you have created your SLO skill statement and the initial skills profile, where you identified where students would be when they come into your classroom. Now we're going to look at what are your expectations for students at the end of the year. This component is called the targeted skills profile. Keep in mind, this is not the same as the initial skills profile. The initial skills profile captures where students start with the SLO skill statement, and the targeted skills profile captures where students should be with the SLO skill statement at the end of the course. So let's talk a little bit about the targeted skills profile. Where do you want your students to be at the end of the course? While the targeted skills profile is similar in structure to that of the initial skills profile, note that the purpose is completely different. The teacher uses the initial skills profile to really find out where the students are in the classroom, but a targeted skills profile is really the roadmap to growing all of your students. So as you begin creating the targeted skills profile, you would want to put typical as a description of your students for the majority of the students in your classroom at the end of the year. The teacher wants to build a targeted skills profile in relationship to the initial skill profile. Just as the initial skill profile resembled a bell curve with the majority of the students, the typical student in the middle of the targeted skill profile should mirror the same thing. This may seem counterintuitive, but the teacher should always have higher and lower students, which we know, in addition to where most of the students will land. This allows the teacher to push and grow students in a way that allows them to focus on the skills that they gain in an authentic and honest, realistic way, while still pushing higher expectations of all students, without the expectation that all students reach the same outcome at the same time. So keep in mind that this is all about differentiated instruction and helping every student to reach their own goal. One thing that's really important to remember with the targeted skills profile, it is perfectly fine for someone to be typical on the initial skills profile at the beginning of the year and still to be typical at the end of the year on the targeted skills profile. There is still growth because the profiles are different, and that's really something that we want to talk about. And this description would be higher. It's more sophisticated, requiring more thinking on the targeted skills profile because the student has had quality, effective instruction throughout the year. So it is not saying that a kid, if they were typical at the beginning, would have to be well above typical. If a student is typical at the beginning and typical at the end, that still shows growth. So here is kind of an example to help wrap your mind around the fact that a student can be typical at the beginning and the end, but still show growth. So let's look at this. So the skill statement for the swimming example is students will be able to use proper breathing techniques when swimming and continue a forward motion as they take a breath. So at the beginning of the year, when students were just coming into the beginning swim class, the typical student are comfortable walking into the shallow end until they are knee deep with their arm floaties on and playing with others while having small amounts of water splashed in their face. Now, they've been in the swim class for 8 weeks. They've had quality, effective instruction in various swimming techniques. So now at the end of the class, a typical student should be able to practice proper exhaling techniques while their faces are in the water, but look straight forward to get a breath rather than rotate their heads to the side. Students are able to swim 3 to 4 strokes before taking a breath and keep continuous forward motion as they breathe. Students are able to swim one length of the pool, or 25 yards, with ease. So the student is still listed as typical, but as you can see, the student has made tremendous growth towards the SLO skill statement. So let's go back to the academic example. So the SLO skill focus was students are able to design and complete experiments and report their findings, providing supporting evidence from their data and using graphic displays to convey their meaning. So at the beginning of the year, a typical student was described as a student who is able to follow directions to complete an experiment with assistance from the teacher and answer a series of questions about the outcome of the experiment accurately most of the time. Now, after a full year of doing labs, of working with the teacher, of having modeling and going through the learning process and having effective instruction, now at the end of the year, a typical student on the targeted skills profile is described as students plan and implement experiments for investigating key topics assigned using laboratory and technology tools, including devising testable hypotheses, determining the meaning of the outcome of the experiment, and drawing reasonable conclusions. Lab report protocols are followed. So as you can see, the student has grown tremendously in their ability to complete an experiment. We're looking at typical at the beginning and typical at the end, and the growth that happens throughout that process. Now what we're going to do is stop, give you the opportunity to complete step 3, parts A, B, and C on the targeted skill profile. Remember, this is growth that you would expect students to be able to do after quality instruction at the end of the year.